your hands on top of your head.
Well, I didn't.
Now!
And I'll bet your mother had a loud bark.
Good morning. This is Morning Coffee with the Chief. I am your host, Patrick Jordan, retired law enforcement officer to 38 years in law enforcement. On this show, we go over law enforcement movies or crime-related movies. In this case, it's more kind of a terrorism-related movie. We talk about the movie, we review it, we give our own experiences, and then we talk about the issues of today. And I usually do that with some great guests, and I have a fantastic lineup of guests today. But before I get into our guests, let me talk about the Los Angeles Mission. I am on the board of the LA Mission. I advocate for the LA Mission. The LA Mission is an entity that works in downtown Los Angeles in Skid Row, providing services for the homeless of Skid Row. You know, we are plagued with homeless here in LA. We've had another increase in the homeless. The public policies is bad, but the LA Mission is not connected with government. It is a private entity. It is faith-based. It's been offering services to the homeless in Skid Row for over 85 years. They provide over 400,000 meals a year. They provide some basic services for people who choose to be on the streets. And they'll provide a bed for those guys who want some temporary shelter off the streets, a place to get a shower, a place to get their mail, and just some basic clothing, socks, which are a big deal for the homeless. And while they do this, they also seek people who are ready to get off the street, and they put them in intensive program with wraparound services to meet all of their needs, to integrate them back in society. And they do it with donor money. They did not get government money, which is why I'm pushing you and advocating that you go to losangelesmission.org and write a check, or use your credit card online and just make a donation, $25, $50, $100, to help somebody who's ready to get off the street or to meet their basic needs. The Los Angeles Mission, losangelesmission.org. Do a good deed for today. So on today's show, we are doing the movie Dirty War, and I have a couple of really great guests. I got to tell a little story first. So I was doing a show, I think I started doing this back in March. And one of my shows, somebody watched the show, and we'll bring him on a little bit later. And he said, you need to do Dirty War. And then I hadn't seen the movie, and I watched it, and I understood why they want to do the Dirty War. And for a big chunk of my career, I was working transit policing, which was ground zero, or a likely target, considered a soft target for terrorism. So I was in the anti-terrorism game for many, many years, and I made a lot of friends and a lot of connections, some really smart guys there. And I brought a couple of them on today for us to talk to. My first guest is a retired lieutenant for the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, Dr. John Sullivan. Now I have John on before because he wrote his PhD thesis on Mexican drug cartels. But prior to getting into Mexican drug cartels, he has deep knowledge and still writes about terrorism stuff, anti-terrorism techniques, and even prior to that, he was a transit policing expert as well. And John was on my staff for a while. One of the smartest guys I know. And the sign of a good leader is to surround them by smart people, even if those smart people are smarter than them. I had no problem having John on my staff, because if I need an idea, I went to John. John, how you doing this morning?
Hey, Pat, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Now, you want me to plug a book here. Can you tell me the title of the book, and maybe we get Martine to put it up here?
Yeah, it's Countering Terrorism and WMD, or Weapons of Mass Destruction. It was one of my early, I think it was my second book, edited collection, looking at the whole range of terrorism response and building response networks, intelligence networks to counter weapons of mass destruction, which are basically chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive means, and the combination thereof. If I was to rewrite it now, I would add drones and swarms and AI to the mix. But that was state of the art. And it came out roughly around the time Dirty War came out. In fact, I recall when I pulled up the video watching Dirty War when it first came out back in 2004 when I was running counterterrorism response for LA County.
So in your book and the movie, they're definitely, it's a realistic. They give a realistic theme in the movie as what would happen if we faced a radiological bomb, or we call it a dirty bomb. But give us a technical name for that, and would you say that the movie is fairly realistic?
The technical name for what they call the dirty bomb is a radiological dispersal device, or an RDD. And I think generally the Dirty War is a accurate assessment. I think they get a little dramatic and over the top on the effects. I don't think a vehicle-borne IED, a suicide car bomb, would necessarily have caused as large a signature of damage as they did in all the secondary fires. But I think they did that because if you try to convey radiation to the lay audience, you can't see radiation. It's not like there's smoke. Most of the deaths from this are going to come from the blast. So they enhanced it a little. But despite that, it was realistically accurate when it talked about the challenges to the responders, when it talked about the fear that occurs, when it talked about the problems of decon. In parallel to my role with the Sheriff's Department, I spent 10 years as a member of the National Medical Response Team, which was a national response team for WMD terrorism. It was initially part of the U.S. Public Health Service and then transitioned to Department of Homeland Security when they came on board. And we worked on these issues. And when I finished that, I was the Force Protection Intelligence Officer for the team. When I first went on the team, which was part of the National Disaster Medical System, I was the decon unit leader. So I did live decon training together with groups like the CBRF, the Chemical Biological Incident Response Force up at Dugway, Utah. We did live agent training and worked with nuclear materials out at the National Test Site in Nevada, on where they once blew up the actual nuclear bombs. So the decon there is a challenge, and I know we'll talk about it later, but it remains a challenge.
Yeah, and we will talk about that later. I noticed you visited up there and you got a great glow about you, so maybe that's from there. And you can see his book title scrolling where you can get it from Amazon underneath on the screen here. There's the title. Do yourself a favor. It's probably a fairly quick read, although there's some technical stuff in there. But it gives you an idea of what the real threat is, and we'll get into that real threat in a minute here after I bring in my second guest. And my second guest is retired Sergeant Eric Fox, and Eric is the guy who recommended the movie. So thank you for recommending the movie, Eric, and thank you for coming on my show. But he also he was with our hazmat team, and were you on the bomb squad? I'm trying to remember. I know you worked at Emergency Operations Bureau as well. Is that true? I'm trying to remember your career.
I actually spent almost 11 years at Emergency Operations Bureau, and it so happens that John Sullivan was my boss also. And he challenged me in good ways and taught me a lot. And then about 2015, I was asked if I wanted to go to the WMD Hazmat Detail, which is now under the Special Enforcement Bureau. And of course, I couldn't say no. So my career started with basically shadowing Mick Kelleher, who was a sergeant at the time, along with Detective Mark Seibel, Wayne Carpini, and we had two chemists on staff, Ken Lee and Aaron. So it was a heck of a good career. And to answer your question, the bomb squad is actually separate from the hazmat detail, but we worked together in a lot of incidents. And
Well, thank you for recommending the movie, and I have to tell you, you're saying names that I haven't heard in a long time, and I go, oh yeah, that guy. Oh yeah, I remember Mick, and and then the chemist. I wasn't as close to the chemist, but I do remember them coming to meetings and participating in meetings. They probably remember my name more than I remember theirs, just because I was the guy running the meeting, probably. But so My time doing anti-terrorism stuff was really, I think, a high point in my career. I enjoyed it. I felt like I had an impact, although mine was more bringing in money for you guys and helping to push programs that you guys had recommended and get them through the bureaucracy of the department and the Byzantine challenges of the region, and because there were many. But one of the persons that was a leader in this is Detective Mark Seibel. He passed away, and we wanted to honor him. And I think we can get his picture up here. Mark helped to develop and start the hazmat team, and the thing you will see in the movie why that is so incredibly important. Most agencies do not have this capability. Martine, do we have a picture of Detective Seibel that you can put up? Martine, I think we lost Martine. Did we lose Martine, John? Okay. Well, we're just going to keep going. Anyways, Detective Seibel is started it way back with John, what, 10, 12 years ago? Or probably longer than that.
Well, longer. We started in 98, basically.
98.
Yeah. We started the hazmat team. We were working at that time. The precursor to the current hazmat team was called the Field Assessment Support Team. It was a component of the LA Terrorism Early Warning Group. And we created the capability in partnership with the FBI and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And we did a whole series of training, got hazmat training. In fact, both Mark and I initially got industrial technician training. Then Mark exceeded that, went further. I got promoted, moved into other things. But we did the first large use of the hazmat capability for the Democratic National Convention in 2000.
Yes.
We brought together the Field Assessment Support Team. We did live assessments during that event. We actually were able to determine that there was an incident where there was a bunch of contaminated gasoline inside a bunch of California Highway Patrol cars, and there was a thought that it might have been intentional, and we were able to use our gas chromatograph mass spectrometer to determine that it wasn't intentional. There, in fact, the gasoline that was delivered was actually delivered in a truck that had diesel in it, a tanker that had diesel in it beforehand, and so it was just a normal snafu. But we used that capability and detection capability numerous times during that potential high risk period. There was no WMD threat. But the other thing I'll point out, you mentioned Mark. Mark and I, we together went up to Dugway Proving Ground and out to the National Test Site in Nevada and did actual live agent training for chemical, biological, and radiological materials at those times. And I tell you what, I was Mark's sergeant when I left emergency operations and went to transit, and Mark was in hazmat. He consistently came and supported us when we were at transit to bring the WMD, detection capability right there to what was one of our high risk targets. So Mark was a great gentleman. I fondly remember him.
Can we put his pick up there, Martine? There we go. There's the guy we remember. And I remember him mostly because he was the technical expert and he was a guy that was asking me to get money for stuff, but he did support transit heavily. The challenge, I remember when 9/11 happened, one of the things, the intel things that came out of there was that they were looking at at least doing biological agents and chemical agents on transit systems. And so we had to develop at least an understanding and knowledge of those systems, let alone a capacity to respond to them. You can go ahead and take it down again, Mark. Take the picture down, Mark. So first of all, Mark passed away about a year, September 11th, surprisingly, September 11th, 2022, the anniversary of 9/11. And he was critical to the development of a critical asset for the region of Los Angeles County to respond to hazmat and stuff like that. Erica, you recommended that we do in honor of him. You want some final words before we move on to our movie regarding Mark?
Yeah, and like you said, and John said, Mark was pivotal in the development of what we know the hazmat detail now. He was actually world renowned. He was Actually, he was a federalized agent from the FBI, and actually worked with their hazmat response team. He was actually responsible. There was an anthrax case out of Salt Lake City, and he was actually sent to Salt Lake, and he is the one that actually went to the suspect's house and recovered and the evidence of anthrax. So he was very well respected throughout the community, not only like in California, but state and the worldwide. He was also asked to speak at the CBRNE Convergence Conference several times in Japan, England, you name it. He was very well respected. Uh, my last federal case with Mark was, and to premise that, we had an outstanding relationship with our local FBI, WMD folks. And so they depended on us, they leaned on us quite a bit to handle a lot of their stuff, regardless of where it was. And when I say regardless of where it was, our last case together with the FBI was, I got a call, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Eric, it's Mark. What's up? Says, call lieutenant, call the captain, call the chief. We're rolling to Bakersfield. I'm like, what? I said, yeah, we're rolling to Bakersfield. I can't go into details into the type of case we were handling, but we were not just LA County. FBI requested us, like I said, on that occasion, to go up to Bakersfield and do a hot entry into a specific situation they had, and we did all the evidence collection for them.
Yeah.
So he was also responsible for writing all the standard operating procedures for the team, a lot of policy for the department, and a lot of training for the department. So he was a jack of all trades. He was very devout hazmat guy. He was very particular, very focused, and besides that, he was an outstanding guy. I mean, he was serious when he was in the office, but once in a while I could make him laugh and smile. And I just, one last quick note is that probably about 4 days before I retired, it was just him and I in the office. And he goes, look, I'm telling you right now, Eric, because I'm not going to get up there and I'm not going to get all, teary-eyed and mushy in front of everybody at your retirement party. So this is it. I said, I consider you a very good friend, and we're going to say our goodbyes right now. And he just stood up and gave me the biggest bear hug I've ever received. So, but that was Mark. He was an outstanding man.
Well, so just to put it for the public who are watching, the capacity or the ability for the region, Los Angeles region and Southern California to respond is built upon the shoulders of people like Mark Seibel to respond to what we call it CBRNE, but that's what chemical, biological, nuclear, radiological, and explosives is the end one, right? Is that the E, CBRNE?
Yes.
Yeah. And and just to put it in context for the latest news, it would be somebody like his team, and I don't know how much of it is true, is the Fresno thing where they said they got an illegal Chinese biolab up there. I don't know how much of that is true or not, or if that's just. But if it wasn't an illegal biolab, Mark or people like Mark would be going up there to help gather the evidence to prosecute the case. And so these are real threats, and we need people like Mark to advocate so that we have the capacity to deal with them. So thank you so much for the efforts of Mark. We miss him. He's a big loss for the profession. And even though he retired, there's no doubt in my mind he would have been consulting around the country if he was still alive. So let's get into our movie, guys. And so the movie is Dirty War, and it was released in 2004. And it was let's see, the writer was Lizzie Mickery, and the director was Daniel Percival. Of course, he was the writer, as part of one of the writers as well. And I don't see a lot of big names in here, but I'm not used to all these British guys. But they had a lot of different actors in here, and it was a made-for-television movie. So this wasn't released, a cinematic release. So it was made-for-television movie. And in my opinion, I got John's opinion before, and we'll let him talk a little bit. I thought this was very realistic, the movie. Oh, yeah, he already gave us it. It was pretty realistic. So, Eric, what do you think? You saw it, and particularly the challenges of being attacked, going in there to gather evidence, or even just operating in a contaminated environment. I know most of the people we saw operating in a contaminated environment were fire, but really the suits are the same, the challenges are the same. Can you speak to how hard it is to have to work in a contaminated environment like that, whether it's nuclear or biological?
It's the one thing that we all learned right off the bat when we started our training was that you have to trust your equipment. There's several pieces of PPE or personal protective equipment, suits that we wear depending on what kind of environment we're going to go into. Obviously, for the fire department, they're what we call their brush gear, not the brush gear, but their turnouts. That would have been an appropriate thing to wear into that kind of situation, because you have fire, you have, in that situation, you have both gamma and alpha radiation. Alpha, the turnouts are going to protect them from actually anything penetrating their suits. Gamma, forget it. There's nothing that could protect you from gamma rays. But the response part of it was pretty accurate. You learn early in your training that, again, you have to trust your training, and you have to be confident in what you're doing to be able to go in there and actually properly do the job. And like John alluded to, I also went into Anniston, Alabama for live agent training, as well as Mercury, Nevada. And in Mercury, I'm sorry, in Anniston, you actually go into a biological environment. And call me a geek, but I liked it so much I went twice, and I went through the hot course twice, just because it was an incredible experience, and it really taught you to train well and trust your equipment. So that's one thing that I always harped on, is be able to trust your equipment, know your equipment, because once you're in that environment, you have to be able to do the task at hand and not have to worry about what your equipment is, and trusting your equipment.
And that's a detail-oriented kind of job, right? You got to be somebody
Absolutely.
that, so you can't take it lightly. And I really wanted to get into, as we showed our first clip here, and it basically it shows the challenges of working in that environment. And when they have a suit that breaks open, that technically you're dead. I mean, they get a little dramatic about it, but so let's put a nuclear, a dirty bomb attack, a radiological device attack, dispersion attack into context, so that everybody knows as we talk about this. John, there was a kind of a quadrant kind of thing that they used, where they showed high likelihood or low likelihood, high consequence, low consequence kind of. So this would be a low likelihood, high consequence kind of event. And the consequences are so stiff if you have a nuclear attack that you have to prepare for this. You have to give it credibility. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to give one. I want to make a distinction between nuclear and radiological.
Okay.
Now, a radiological dispersal device does not include a nuclear blast. It doesn't go critical. You would call that an improvised nuclear device. And certainly terrorists could construct those, although there are some technical barriers. They could steal one, although there are some technical barriers. A radiological dispersal device is really more of a weapon of mass disruption than of mass destruction. It's not going to, RDD or a dirty bomb is not likely to kill relatively large numbers of people. It's not likely to cover a wide area. And of course, that depends upon how much radiological sources involved, what radiological sources involved. But I'll point out that the majority of sources used are used in commercial use, like cobalt 60, cesium-137. Those are things that are used by engineering, by medical uses. There are isotopes that are out there. They create ionizing radiation. I think the real disruption comes because people are afraid of nuclear. And partially to the layperson, nuclear is ominous. You can't see it, therefore the fear amplifies. For the responder, well, nuclear, you can't stay in the environment long. There's three things to keep in mind: time, distance, and shielding. And you saw this in the movie. You stay in there for as little time as possible. As you don't want to get cumulative whole body doses, because those are most likely not to cause immediate death, although they could. They're most likely going to cause excess cancers over time. Distance, the further away you are, the less potent the source is. Shielding, if you can shield it, gamma and neutrons are harder to shield than, alpha and beta. I mean, piece of paper is going to shield you from alpha particles. Unless you inhale them, then you have a real problem. So one of the things that I'd say when you look at the thing, there's a whole range of complex threats that occur. When they show the suits being ripped, and that wouldn't kill you immediately in a radiological event. That would be more like a chemical event, because even biological stuff is going to take longer. I think the real threat when wearing that suit for a long period of time is the performance decrement that comes from heat stress and dehydration. Because when I ran the decon unit for the National Medical Response Team, we always made sure people were hydrated. We made sure that if you were using a respirator, we preferred, if you weren't using an SCBA, a self-contained breathing apparatus, that you use a powered air purifying respirator, because that lowered the heat stress on you.
So it's a fatiguing. So there's really two issues here.
Fatigue,
one, if it's
fear.
What's the threat of whatever it's nuclear, the threat or the long-term threat of being in the environment, but more importantly, the fatigue related to the equipment. But I really wanted to get into so this is a low likelihood of an event, but we prepare because the casualty of an event like this would be catastrophic.
Not as catastrophic as a nuke. And even a nuke, depending on the size you have, you're not going to get, large total nuclear war capability in a terrorist situation. You're getting 1 to 10 kiloton devices in the improvised nuclear device capability. The RDD, significantly less. The RDD, the blast is coming from the bomb, so the people that are immediately exposed to the bomb are going to be immediately, get the casualties you normally get, the trauma, burns, things of that nature. I think the real casualty comes, and casualty does not necessarily mean dead. It means you're impacted. It's going to come with the need to decon. And when you look at the number of people and the time it takes to decon people, they didn't have enough in this movie, and we don't have necessarily in one place here today. That's why you had national teams to support the capability. That's why the Marine Corps created the Chemical Biological Incident Response Force. I think where a place like Los Angeles or New York or large cities have an inherent benefit is we have specialty capability. We have large hazmat teams already in place. We have numbers of hazmat teams already in place. We have hazmat task forces where you can augment the engine companies, because decon is basically water, right? You're going to put water on people, and you got to get them to scrub. You don't want them to abrade themselves, because you don't want to get so you want to gently do it. But if people are incapacitated, decon can take a long time.
Well, let's talk about two issues. I think we've already done if it was real, a slide, and we show the response. But so I'll 2 points that Eric, hopefully you can address here is, first of all, the radiological device, or even a chemical device or biological, those are much harder to do. And the most likely attack scenario that we dealt with, for the most part, were small improvised explosive devices and active shooters. And we saw that in London, we saw that in Spain, we saw that in Russia, Mumbai's transit attacks, and then the Mumbai's attack around their community. Those were the kind of things. Even San Bernardino was an active shooter kind of thing. That's the likely attack scenario. So this is an unlikely attack scenario, but it is an attack scenario that Al Qaeda and others explored. So can you explain those in terms of likelihood versus just the difference between the two, and why it's that way? Why is it so hard to do a radiological attack?
Like John said, is number one, getting the material to be able to make an RDD is pretty hard. Just from working those years that I did and dealing with the hospitals who use cesium-137 for medical purposes, and even cobalt-60, they're actually, the whole industry in cooperation with the DNDO are now are going away from actual radiation to do some of those procedures, and they're doing kind of a synthetic process to achieve the same results, but without that danger of radiation. There was also, there's so many security components that have to go into even at a clinic or a hospital that go with radiation, that's one of the reasons why they've done away with that. Again, for them to be able to, a terrorist, whether it be, Al Qaeda or even a homegrown extremist, to get their hands on it would be extremely hard. And like John had alluded to, is that it's if there was an RDD, depending on what source it was, whether it be a gamma or an alpha source, it's more the psychological impact, knowing that an RDD per se has gone off. And yeah, you're going to get the most impact with the actual initial explosion. Now, of course, as soon as the news media, especially nowadays, when they start saying that was a radiological dispersal device or that was a nuclear bomb, because to be honest with you, we got to be honest, they don't know the difference between a nuclear bomb and an RDD. So they're going to say whatever they think is going to get the most views, and it's going to create more panic for the audience or for the citizens. So going back real quick is, like John said, alpha particles, you need, a piece of paper, actually even your skin, as long as there's no open wounds, will protect you from alpha unless you inhale it. When we did training, you have to be with your, dosimeters and your equipment, you have to be an inch off of the actual alpha particles to actually detect it. So in this case, in the movie, when they say there was alpha and gamma, they're going to detect the gamma radiation right away with a personal radiation devices, but the alpha, unless you actually know that it was there, it's going to take you a long time to actually be able to get that. Now, like I said, the low consequence, high impact, like you said, is probably an active shooter, and we trained a lot for that. These terrorists, both, international and homegrown extremists, have found out that they get, unfortunately, more bang for the buck as an active shooter. They bring more panic because anybody could, literally anybody could get their hands on a weapon, regardless of whether it's an automatic, semi-automatic, or a handgun. And they could do more psychological and more deaths based on that. We all, both John and I, and even you and your teams back at Transit, we also train for the biological and biological. As much as it's scary, I didn't mind dealing with biological agents, and I did that several times, but it's more of the chemical part of it, where somebody may release, a home chemical as ammonia or chlorine in an enclosed, confined space as a subway, and that would create, number one, possible deaths, obviously injuries, and a lot of panic, and basically a cigar tube underground. So I know your teams that you helped develop and we helped train for that, along with the fire department and our partners over with LAPD.
Well, let's get into the response part of this so people understand. After 9/11, they realized that no department, no entity is an island, that mutual aid is critical. And it is this mutual aid network that we have, certainly in California, that was emulated after 9/11 around the country, that allows for multiple teams from all over the place to be trained up and to maintain a level of skill sets. And large agencies are able to fund that can be brought to the area where the attack occurs to do things like, mitigating efforts, response efforts, or decon efforts. And that was a big part of your time at EOB, is managing resources that can be brought together in a coordinated response. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's improved?
When I first got the Emergency Operations Bureau back in 2007, and just to parlay off of that, I got chosen to also manage the UWASI Urban Area Security Initiative grants. But shortly thereafter, I got picked to be the mutual aid coordinator for the County of Los Angeles, which included all 88 cities, and I was a direct liaison with the state of California, Cal OES. That was an absolute monster to handle, because you have 88 different personalities, and you have to basically corral everybody together to work together, like we say, play well in a sandbox, on the law enforcement side of the house. It was very rewarding to be able to work with all these agencies and actually see the fruits of the labor, not only mine, but my predecessors, Jim Solly, who was there as well. and be able to make one phone call and say, hey, we need 100 cops because we have this brush fire going or we have this demonstration going. And just knowing that once you make that phone call, you're going to start hearing lights and siren and boots on the ground arriving. So it was a very important, and still is an extremely important aspect of law enforcement, both in the state of California. The state of California actually started the mutual aid system,
Yes.
and with the fire department, the fire scope, but it's obviously gone nationwide and it's taught everywhere. So again, it's a critical component, and not only on day-to-day incidents, earthquakes, riots, whatever, but on the hazmat side, it's a very, believe it or not, it's a very small community in LA County. Literally, the only actually full-time law enforcement hazmat teams in LA County are LA County Sheriff's Department and LAPD. And the FBI is not operational, the more investigative part of it. And then you have the LA County Fire Department, LA City Fire Department, that have their hazmat teams. They're historically more involved in the non-terrorism side of hazmat, such as oil spills, fuel spills, chemical spills, whatnot. But they are trained to a certain aspect or up to a certain level to be able to make entries with us, and they did that all the time.
Well, let's bring up our next clip, and this is terrorist cells. Hopefully, John will come back because I want to ask him and I'll ask you, Eric, as well, as this slide runs, and it shows basically they're explaining how the terrorist cell works, which I've been through that training before, both in Los Angeles and then up at the Naval Postgraduate School, and basically this is kind of the investigative piece. You get a link into or information in somebody, and if you're going to break a terrorist cell, you have to find the first link. And if you actually read the 9/11 Commission report, it talks about there was people who were muscle, the people that were brought in to get on the planes, and those were the people who did surveillance and the practical surveillance and of their targets and how they were going to operate and how it was going to work. And these terrorists, they don't want to invest a lot of money and fail. They want to be successful when they plan these events. So as we see this terrorist cell, there is a little bit of structure. Now this devolved into radicalizing people and being lone wolves or cells that were not connected with. But originally in 9/11, we had the cell operation. So the first question I really want to get to is one, I still see international terrorism, particularly Islamic terrorism, as a threat to the United States. Now, it probably is not the same as in 9/11, but I think if they felt they had the capacity to hit us and get away with it, they would. So I'll throw that question to John. Do you see it the same way? Do you think we're prioritizing as a nation that threat appropriately?
I agree that the threat of Islamic terrorism remains. I have long thought that we get tunnel vision on the threat of the day, the current threat, and forget that there are other threats. Now, I look at this. I started studying terrorism in 1978. And I studied with a lot of the key scholars then. And at that point in time, Middle Eastern terrorism, not Islamic terrorism as we know it now, was a major threat. We looked at groups like, the PLO and Hezbollah, which remains. As my career matured, as you recall, I worked for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey before I came out here to California. And I lived in Jersey City. And by the Grove Pass station in Jersey City, there was a Chinese restaurant. The Chinese restaurant, they spoke Arabic and Spanish, not English. Upstairs from the Chinese restaurant, there was a mosque. And the mosque was, the preacher was the gentleman, Rahman, who was known as the Blind Sheikh, who was engaged in the series of attacks against United States infrastructure. The 93 World Trade Center bombing, which at that time was the biggest hole in the ground I ever saw. Went out there, talked to the first in responders. There were guys I worked with before I came out here. I was shocked. We worked in the 90s when I was at EOB, and EOB still had a lot of the public order intelligence mission. We largely were looking at right-wing extremism. We didn't consider Islamic terrorism to be a major event, even after the 93 attack. Because remember, In 95, you had the Oklahoma City attack, which was a
Yeah.
right-wing attack. In 98, we saw with the East Africa bombings that Al-Qaeda was becoming more active. They had declared war against the United States. Osama bin Laden became the hallmark of that later on Zawahiri. So we get mixed messages. We see right-wing extremism, and this is salient today, because today we say right-wing extremism is on the rise. It in fact is. And globally, and it's globally connected and networked, but it didn't make Islamic extremism go away. If you go into Africa right now, groups like the Islamic State, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, a competitor to Al-Qaeda at the moment, is still heavily active. But so is Al-Qaeda. They haven't conducted attacks recently. And you can ask yourself, is it because do they have the capacity to conduct attacks? That's been degraded by U.S. military and intelligence and law enforcement, which remains, in my mind, the core capacity you need. The police.
Well, I think as Afghanistan found out, it doesn't pay to be a host to these guys, because ultimately you're gonna be dealt some pain. And I think the U.S. military did a pretty good job at, even though we may not strategically won, we didn't get our strategic goals. We inflicted a heck of a lot of long memories. They have long memories of our capabilities,
that's the key. Afghanistan, we're no longer there. The Taliban is now on the ascendant. The Taliban didn't just decide to play by our rules. We would hope they did, but they've become radicalized again, stepping back. Islamic terrorism, you can't kill an idea. You can arrest people. You can only give a better idea. We need to be vigilant. I don't think we need to lose, compromise our liberties. We need to be able to prioritize law enforcement and maintain our values, but we need to know that we have to manage more than one threat at a time.
So let me get into. So I read Biden's national priority for terrorism, and it seemed to focus primarily on what he considered right wing or white nationalism kind of terrorism, and I emphasized it. I think more so than I just don't see the threat as being as challenging, and we could disagree on that. But I think it does take our eye off the ball on international terrorism, particularly Islamic terrorism or Al-Qaeda. Erica, your thoughts on that, and John, I want to follow up with a question on terrorism cells.
Yeah, I think back when we're still engaged in Afghanistan and that era, it was very prevalent in the news. That's what everybody talked about, and like you said, that the priorities here have changed recently in the recent years to where you don't hear that chatter on the news anymore. It's more of a localized active shooter event where they're trying to find out who this person was, what their motive was, etc. I think, like John said, and like you've already mentioned, is that as a nation and intelligence experts in our country, and I'm hoping they're still doing is keeping their eye on the ball. Because look at between 9/11, 1993 bombing and 9/11, it was pretty much quiet. There was nothing really homegrown except talking very scattered incidents, but they went dormant. And what were they doing when they're dormant? They were planning the next attack on 9/11. That's exactly what happened. I think as a country, we need to remain vigilant, obviously both, internationally, especially I think internationally and homegrown. I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of politics being played nowadays that, I'm not talking about, candidates and stuff, but just politics as to what should we be focused on, whether it be, on the homeland or outside internationally. So I think, like John said, we need to, as a country, stay focused and not lose focus on what's going on in the entire world.
Well, so John, a cell, we want to interdict those cells overseas, right? And I think we are still projecting a certain amount of power overseas to disrupt these things. I do have concerns that I think in 2021 we had 78 people on the terrorist watch list captured at the southern border, and those are just the ones we know about. We don't know, and so I look at that and I go, wow, we used to be really focused on securing our borders and our ingresses into the country. Now it seems like we're less concerned about that, and that's the part that is a problem for me. I have to believe our intelligence agencies are still looking for a list of people who are a threat. And I mean, we killed. I think we killed. Did we kill Sawari? I think that was us, and then we're hitting some of these other people with drone attacks. But so we're still focused, and we're still dealing with them overseas. But I'm just concerned that our borders and our ports are a problem these days.
Well, Pat, there's a couple of things that come there. One is, to go back to the earlier discussion, we have to deal with multiple threats, multiple simultaneous threats. And right-wing terrorists and Islamist terrorists at times cooperate, right? Because if you look at things like the Madrid bombing, where Islamist cells from Northern Africa, Algeria, come together with other groups, people that were in France, people that were in Belgium, and people in Italy and people in Turkey. You have cells dispersed globally, and they interact with local cells. So you have foreign and local occurring at the same time. In fact, when you look at the strategic options that global terrorist groups have, they play off the seams between foreign and domestic. They know that there are bureaucratic seams, and they use that to their advantage. Even in this movie, you see the playing off the seams between customs, the Metropolitan Police, MI5, the security service, and MI6, the secret intelligence service, and even the distinctions between the different specialist units within the Metropolitan Police. The terrorists know that. They also use criminal proxies or criminal allies to help them conduct some of their operations. So when you looked at the different cells that were described by the detective inspector from the Metropolitan Police in this thing, you had logistics cells, you had support cells, you had recon cells, you had action cells, and somebody controlling it. And they don't all know each other. That's all very real. So to conduct that, see, I don't think we don't have our eye on the ball. I think we have many balls to keep our eye on. There's multiple simultaneous. And they hit something in this thing that I thought always concerned me when I ran intelligence analysis programs or synchronized the field people with the analysts, is if we observe part of the kill chain, part of the attack sequence, and they said it came right out in this movie. I thought that was very realistic. Are we seeing the same thread? Is this the same kill chain, or are there multiple kill chains? Could we have more than one conspiracy occurring at a time? Of course we can. And if you don't carefully vet the intelligence when it comes in and see what it is and run it to ground, and they did that for a short movie, an hour and 38 minutes, they did pretty good at getting in there and showing how you run down all these different capabilities and the challenges of decision making that the commanders have, because you balance multiple considerations, right? And that is real. And I will tell you, I've worked with the Metropolitan Police. They have some of the best operational commanders at the senior ranks I've ever seen. We could use more of them here. I hope we don't need them here, but the truth is we do need them. So, but the last thing I'll say here, because this is incredibly complicated, that those networks, you combat a network by having a network. And if you look, you can't rely on just pushing them off, because some of them are already here. And the internet connects people quicker than we can, and ideas transmit for all kinds of reasons. And you see synergistic groups, come up with weird combinations of belief systems that they think violence is the answer. So the way to combat that is having our own network. So we need to partner between local cops and the FBI and the other federal agencies, the intelligence service. We need to cooperate just like NYPD does with foreign police. Right? When I was running the terrorism early warning group here in LA, my goal was to link our group with other similar groups around the world, like in Australia and Canada and the UK, because we're not, and New York and other places, because they may see part of it and we may see part of it. And until we talk to each other, we're not going to know what's actually there, because these are global networks where crime and terrorism converge.
And they might also have good information on how you can prepare. I mean, I saw that with COVID. I tried to get people to respond in a certain way, and they wouldn't listen to me at the time, because I was on phone calls with the Naval Postgraduate School is hosting conversations with graduates, and I was trying to get some people to listen to me. They didn't listen to me, and then I got in an accident. I was off. But let's get into the next clip, the radiological material clip, and talk about that. And the smuggling piece of this is the practicality of smuggling nuclear material, particularly I guess gamma, is really bad stuff, right? To try and smuggle that's a challenge, right? To do that, and it shows this in the movie. The guy ends up passing away. It's a lot easier to put, or it's a lot harder to put one of these attacks together than to put just a simple explosive device, a small improvised explosive device, or an active shooter situation. They want to be successful, the terrorists, which is one of the reasons why they move away from the more complicated plots and take on the easier plots, right? So that's why radiological, nuclear, chemical, biological, those are more challenging for these outfits to do. What do you think, Eric?
You know what? Like they alluded to in the movie. I mean, obviously we don't see they don't talk about the pre-planning on, number one, where they got the material, how long it took them to get it. But for somebody to actually do it, it's got to be extremely well planned. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in weeks or even months. It's going to take quite a while to do that. And again, I think it was pretty realistic, especially with the Season 137, which they kind of alluded to, or Cobalt 60, is that if you get high enough dose, which those guys did, they're not going to last that long at all whatsoever. And when they spilt the alpha, I think it was the alpha particles on the ground, and the one guy starts, picking them up, and he rips his mask off. He's bought and paid for at that point. Yeah. But as far as interdicting and basically smuggling, that's one thing that Mark Seibel, and I'll give him all the credit, his credit is due, is that, and I think John was involved as too, is identifying smuggling routes into what we called into our region, LA region. And he developed some SOPs, which we followed, him and I followed, in Wayne at the time in Milk. I mean, weekly, if not daily, where, basically we would identify that the 5 freeway at the Grapevine was a good, what we call a great choke point for us to be able to sit in our vehicles. And we had detection capabilities in those trucks to be able to identify and detect and identify a radiological source, whether it be a bad stuff, an industrial, or a medical. And I would sit on the northbound 5 freeway at the Orange County line at the same time. So we would basically cover that choke point, and we would do that weekly. Now, also another thing that they identified was smuggling isotopes or radiation coming in from the ocean into our ports. One thing that was very quickly identified is that, and it's part of the standard operating procedures, is that we would expect some type of smuggling coming in, not on a large container ship or an oil ship, was basically in on a pleasure craft. So we would actually go out and do missions, maritime, what we call maritime missions. And again, we had a capabilities to be able to, detect and identify isotopes. And we would basically spend our time scanning small vehicles. Small vessels, coming into the port. We didn't care if they were going out. We were just concerned with people coming in.
That's the challenge. I mean, so Los Angeles and Long Beach are the largest port system in the country. So if it was coming in shipping containers, it'd be really hard to detect, right? I imagine you could put some capacity of detection, but then you think about California's coast. I don't know how long that is, and all the different ports for pleasure crafts. I mean, even it's hard for us to stop these pongo boats coming up with cocaine, right? So getting it in overseas. So even though a lot of people talk about the border and how it's a problem, that's not necessarily our weakest link, is the border, right? Because there's still some challenges to smuggling material across the southern border, in particular. It might actually be easier coming in on a pleasure craft. Or yeah, go ahead, John.
I think you hit something that is really important to understand when you deal with this. You have to have a multifaceted approach to countering the threat. So point detection is important. There are choke points, and Mark and I did in fact spend lots of time working with lots of national specialists on figuring out where the choke points were and the best place to interdict. But you can't be everywhere. You can't You can't, shipping. Yes, we can target containers. There's a lot of containers that come through. The containers provide shielding, which make it difficult to detect. There are false, I'm not going to mention what they are, but there are false positives that occur in the natural environment that throw off your detection. So you use detection, you use targeted detection, and you randomize that to hit those areas, but then you augment that with intelligence. And you use intelligence to take threats from different places, because there are people that traffic in nuclear material. There are people that traffic in everything that's clandestine that makes money for somebody. There are people that traffic it. And one of the ways, one of the things a lot of investigators like to talk about is follow the money. Well, there are people making money off of this. And if we can track that money and triangulate that, so for the financial side, the threat side, the detection side, you bring all those together, you can narrow the ability of your adversary, terrorists, to conduct operations.
And that's why you do these randomized detection things. It is unlikely, as Eric and you guys hitting one pleasure craft, but if you do enough where it creates a level of deterrence, you create a little anxiety in the terrorists because they want to be successful. I mean, I remember I was reading when I read the 9/11 Commission report. I mean, they really talked about the likelihood of success. They had plans that they nixed because they didn't think they would be likely to be successful, but they went along this one because it seems complex, but there was a fair amount of simplicity to it. It was relatively low cost for them to pull off. I want to say it was like $400,000 or something like that. But they felt like there was confidence that they would be successful, and there was multiple teams doing the attack at the same time, so they felt they could probably get something. I think that's what I came away with that. So the harder and more complex the operation, the least likely it's going to happen. And when you're talking about radiological, nuclear, biological, or chemical, those add a degree of complexity to make it harder. But it also gives, as you guys are talking about, the opportunity for us to detect if we have the systems in place to do the detection, which is really what we're talking about. I'm afraid we pulled back. We're not paying quite close attention now. I've been away from it for 10 years. But it does come up. It does bring up the next, like it's in the movie, the next area of concern that we need to really be focused on, and that's informants. So Martin, go ahead and run that slide. And what I really liked about this, and I really wanted to talk about it, because I felt when Sheriff Baca put together, he had a team that worked with the Muslim community. I forget what they called it, and I recognized at the time, even though there was pushback, why are we working with the Muslims? He got attacked on that. I think he went to Capitol Hill and he kind of got attacked on it. But and the thing is, that's where your informant's going to come from. You're going to have a lot of honest, hardworking Muslim Americans who don't believe in any of this stuff, or even immigrants who don't believe in any of this stuff, who are humanist, and they're likely to be the people who are going to give you information on the cells and what's going on. And so you have to be engaged in those communities. You have to understand that these are human beings, and they're not always driven by ideology. And I think they kind of show that in the movie, John, with the informant that they develop, who calls them up and she gives them information. So can you talk about the importance of informant development in those communities that are likely to be radicalized? And this doesn't have to be Islamic, right? It could be, as we talk about, white nationals, whatever the flavor is, who's the most active. It's important for us to be engaged in those communities, right?
Well, Pat, it's important to be engaged in all communities, and it's not just informants in the sense of confidential informants. It's building positive relationships with the community. The core of policing and the core of counterterrorism, and indeed the core of counter transnational organized crime, where I've been spending the last couple decades really heavily focusing, is in community policing, because the police are the visible part of the government that helps build public trust and legitimacy for the government. If we don't have legitimacy, alternate power structures come to play. If you're active in the community and working with the community, look, everybody wants the same thing. They want to go home, have dinner, be with their kids, be with their family. There's a few people that capitalize on violence. They're an aberration. The way you prevent that is by having a better message. A better message is working in the community. One of the things, and I ran specialist teams of several. Eric's been on specialist teams. That's important. We in specialist teams we supported the line cop, the community police, but the community police are essential because if you look at like attacks on transit systems, for example, which both you and I spent a lot of time considering working interdicting. I think we probably did interdict some, but when you look at places like the UK where they have a deeper experience with terrorism, a lot of their attacks were actually interdicted by community police. They were actually, it was the cop on the beat. It was the Bobby walking his beat that interdicted the attack. And we've had similar things. Yu Kikamura arrested on the New Jersey Turnpike because a state trooper stops him on a rainy night, looks in the back of the car and sees a bomb and says, "This ain't right." Community policing is there. The specialist teams we bring are important. They bring capability, but you need to have them all.
So that was the Red Brigade in the 70s, was it not, John? Yeah, that one, that example. Oh, how do I know this trivia, John?
I don't know. We used to talk about this stuff with
yeah. Well, I
trying to calibrate our response.
I just, the informant in this movie was just a regular citizen, and their communities are impacted too if this explosion goes off. Their lives are impacted too because they live in London, right? And so informants are a critical piece, and she supplies the lady with the scarf overhead. I forget what not a head job. I don't know what they call it when it's just a scarf there, but she was a critical piece because she pointed a finger at people who were likely involved in something nefarious. And she says, hey, it's barrels, they got SIM cards. And of course, those were things that would get our attention right away, right? Particularly if we're tracking a possible threat or we're aware of a possible threat. But I think it's important. You can't just, I gave a speech at this location. It was 10 years after 9/11 and they wanted an update. And there were some really hardcore people to the right who did not believe that we should be engaged at all with Muslims in the LA area. And I think, I want to say Mike Downing was given a speech as well with LAPD. And they were all over us, just all over us because we were engaged in the Muslim community. Yet if we were going to get a piece of information to disrupt something, we would most likely get it from people going to those very same mosques as the people who were, if they were radicalized, were going to, or operating in those same communities, just like in this movie. So it's important to maintain that engagement to be successful at disrupting these attacks. What do you think, Eric?
You know what, like John and you guys have been talking about is that, informants is, and that's on the intelligence side of the house, is that they have to, as little as the information may be or trivial as may be, is that it's got to be followed upon. I mean, there's been several, we won't go into details, times when folks have come forward with intelligence and they basically been brushed off. And it turns out that information they had was actually pretty accurate. And if they would have followed up on that information, they probably would have been able to stop that, whether it be a crime or more specifically a terrorist attack. And again, I think part of the problem also is agencies working together. Like you alluded to, the Muslim outreach program that the Sheriff's Department had was not looked upon very favorably by many folks, many agencies. And I mean, come to find out, I think it was a great thing. It was misunderstood by a lot of folks. And if they would have taken the time to understand and really look into it and sit down with the experts to find out why the department was doing that, they'd probably find out that, hey, this is why. And, just with that team, I'm sure there's been information that was gathered by them and by intelligence officers that either, stopped an attack or led to the arrest of some bad folks in this, not only in this state or in the county, but probably in the country. And again,
or even better, they worked with law enforcement. They got a chance to know law enforcement. They got to see that law enforcement aren't boogeyman. And so the message, as John said, the values of radicalization versus the value of functioning democracy where you have freedom and you know what I mean? Government's interacting with us. They care about us because they're showing up and talking to us about it. I mean, that's an important aspect of those outreach programs, right?
Yeah, well, Pat, it is. Like for a while, I actually supervised the deputies who worked on that detail, and I went along with them on one of their meetings with Muslim students, and it was out in Orange County, and I sat down, 20 students, a couple of our detectives, and myself, and we're talking. These young students, men and women, had never actually spoken to cops before.
Yeah.
They thought we all hated them and we're just trying to kill them. And when we start explaining to them why we do counterterrorism, why counterterrorism is important, the range of illegal activity we're looking about, that we're not concerned about people's belief systems or what they believe or speech, we're looking at crimes of violence, then they look and they go, we didn't know that. We're glad you came in and talked to us. And now you have, rather than adversaries that could be radicalized, you have people that become like help immunize the community against radicalization. Just
exactly.
Like the woman in the store who saw the police as not adversaries. They saw them as someone they could trust and talk to. And that's the core of community policing. So why you would cut yourself off from a significant part of your community to protect it, I don't understand. But as police, and this is the part people don't know, we manage conflict in our community every day, sometimes better than others, but our goal has got to be to preserve the public peace, right?
And these are the same things if you're trying to deal with gangs or drug cartels or whatever. You're trying to you build up a positive relation with people who might give you that information. Like, Martine, let's go to Deadly Cargo. Let's run that clip, and then go ahead and run right into the next one, varieties of materials. And let me give a little bit of plug. What I want you guys to do, if you're watching us on YouTube, Pop Culture Minefield, is I want you to subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Pop Culture Minefield, and like this video. When you do these things, it helps the algorithms and helps to sell the show. And make a comment, like Eric did. Tell me what movie you want me to do, and certainly comment on what we're talking about today, because it's critically important. But we're also over on Rumble. On the Rumble platform, you have to follow us on Rumble. So it's not subscribe, it's follow. And then you like the video as well. You can comment. And on both platforms, please share those videos if you can. And also check out some of the other some of the other shows on Pop Culture Minefield. They have some great military shows, and they do a great show where they talk about rock and rolling in the 70s. Rock and rolling in the 70s, which is very interesting. One day I want to go on that show and talk about the Sunset Strip. But so as we talk about Deadly Cargo, John, so we kind of alluded to this, at least I did. It's very difficult to smuggle these types of material in order to handle them, to develop a bomb, and it's much easier to go with just a small improvised explosive device. Do you just want to address that briefly?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say, and there are people that traffic in illicit nuclear materials, and there are lots of hoaxes and misunderstandings about that. If you recall, they used to talk about red mercury. That was more of a scam than an actual trafficking material. But there are people that traffic in fissile material, and that's how some rogue nation states have been able to build their nuclear programs. So that does exist. Some of these things, I remember when I was running the counterterrorism stuff in LA back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and there was a concern, near the time of this movie, what happens if somebody gets a spent fuel rod from San Onofre and they decide to weaponize that? And I'm like, well, that's kind of self-limiting. You're not going to be able to pick up a fuel rod and be able to move too long. It's going to kill them, right? So there are technical barriers. Like, there are a couple things. You have to have like organizational capacity. You have to have behavioral resolve, and it has to be technically feasible for an attack to occur, right? And bringing those three together, as we know, having supervised and managed cops and emergency responders, takes a bit of work. It takes experience to cause human beings to work together in a concerted, manner to be able to conduct complex endeavors. It takes a lot of training. In fact, this movie starts with an emergency response exercise, and we need to do more of those. But the other thing I think is equally important, because when you have the technical feasibility, when you have granted high risk, high capability things like nuclear, biological, chemical agents. Chemicals are easier than radiological, nuclear, biological. Yeah, you can brew beer, but getting the recipe right is hard. One of the reasons the terrorists stay with the explosive is because it gives you a large visceral response. People can see it, right? The same thing with an active shooting. It's immediate. People see it. It's visceral. It creates fear. Um, Groups like Aum Shinrikyo tried to do biological attacks and they failed. And when they fail, you don't get an impact, right?
Right.
So that's one of the reasons they do this. Now, the unique thing that comes with an RDD, a radiological dispersal device or a dirty bomb, is you get the best of both worlds from the terrorist view. You can get the visceral blast, and that's where people are going to be killed, but you can amplify the fear with the RDD. We haven't seen many of those, although there's certainly been people who've tried. There have been lots of accidental releases. I think they're probably more common than terrorist attacks. But the reality is we need to be able to prepare for the full spectrum of threat. But we need to calibrate the threat. So and this is where it's hard because, see, every time you interdict an attack, and thank God, the police service in the U.S. and Europe and Australia and worldwide, we interdict more attacks than occur. But when you need to justify the specialist units that conduct these operations, and you go for the budget, then you go to the chief, who goes to the sheriff, who goes to the governing board, and they're like, "We haven't had an attack. We don't need to do this." And it's like, well, the reason we haven't had an attack is because we have people that interdict this stuff. So it's hard. I think the thing this movie laid out was the difficulty of doing mass casualty decon and controlling large crowds of people who are fearful.
And we're going to get into that. But before we move on to that, can you do me a favor, John? Because I know you could probably quote this fairly off the top of your head. What is the FBI's definition of terrorism? Because we need to understand that as we talk about these attacks.
Well, I'll paraphrase. And before I get into, there's more than one definition in the United States Code.
Give me the standard of accepted one.
Approach is going to be terrorism is a use of violence to influence political, social, economic activity. So it's the targeted use of violence with a purpose. So it's not random violence. It's not I shoot somebody and it terrorizes people from a criminal sense. In fact, in the 70s, they called that quasi-terrorism. So when you look at like drug cartel violence, it could be terrorism or it could not. If they're just killing each other for their internal battle, that's not terrorism. If they target, the park in Morelia, well, that's probably terrorism. So it's the instrumental use of violence targeting people for a social, political aim.
Change. And basically, many times to get government to change their policies and their approaches, pretty much. And I mean, that's what...
Calibrate your violence. Over the top violence is counterproductive. And you alluded to it before. Al-Qaeda called off attacks when they knew, and I won't say which ones they were, but they called off attacks in the United States when they were succeeding politically in their own territory because they did not want to bring the negative effect onto their group. Other rebel groups do that as well, because violence is a strategic choice to change conditions by these groups. They're not looking to just kill people for the sake of killing people. They're doing it for an end, which is counter. People often say, well, it's irrational. It's like, no, it's rational.
Yeah,
I mean, it's states use violence too. We call it war. But it gets hard. We have a lot of misunderstanding. I think a lot of what happens now, people call things terrorism because they don't like it. They want to demonize their adversary. They're terrorists. But that's not new. In the 19th century, they called them anarchists. They did the same thing. So when you actually study political violence, or when you want to run a unit whose job is to interdict and prevent and effectively respond, because response helps mitigate, right? And mitigate denies your adversary the ability to gain
mitigation.
benefit.
Well, IKEA had figured out that our response was the Marine Corps, the Army, the Air Force, and the SEALs, and we all came to their party, and I don't think they're going to want us back anytime soon. But I don't think they got the response that they were hoping for, or at least they wanted conflict with us, but they had hoped that everybody would rise up against us, and that didn't necessarily happen. Let's go into a variety of materials because we need to talk about when you're building a different type of bomb that there's multiple avenues to identify that or to figure out that you got a plot going on. So in this one, you'd have to have the radiological material, you'd have to have the explosive material, you'd have to have the containers that could carry this stuff, you have to have the vans, you have to have SIM cards. That's one that came up here. So there's a lot of things that you have to do that have to be in place. And I remember reading about the Madrid attack. And you also have to have people who can get it done. And they do have somebody in this that appears to be a leader. So Eric, on materials and information fed into a fusion center give us the opportunity to disrupt these attacks, right? And that's been the game since after 9/11. Actually, it was before 9/11, but it got ramped up after 9/11 so that we could be more successful. And paying attention to these types of materials that are purchased or trafficked gives us that opportunity to disrupt these types of attacks. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, and like we've all agreed that on the radiological side of the house, uh, they're very highly regulated, both militarily, obviously, but also on the medical and the industrial side. Uh, you cannot just go out there. Well, you can't go out there and anything like they did in this movie. There's certain pieces that if not stored properly, you could get your hands on, but nothing to the point to where they had their isotopes, both gamma and was it cesium 137 and alpha particles. So it would have to be in maybe in other countries where they're not highly regulated. It was obviously a lot easier for them to get it. And just looking at the movie, the isotopes, their weapon of choice did not come from London. It did not come from that
Yeah.
area of the world. It came from another part of the world, and it was shipped in, disguised as cooking oil,
Yeah.
which was interesting because when they put the lead casks inside the oil drums, they fill it up with oil. I think not only for the inspector to see the oil, but it's actually the viscosity of oil is so thick that some of these radiological isotopes, you could feel that radiation just by putting a jug of water in front of it. So that also helped them shield for any detection. So like I said, it's highly regulated. Explosives, obviously, you could go out there and buy certain substances, off the market, off the shelf, and make yourself something not as large, but enough to make an impact.
Well, thank you so much. And I just think that the complexity and the monetary need also give you an opportunity to disrupt it, right? Which is what we're talking about here, because we pay attention to this more serious stuff as much as possible. It's easier to get a AK-47 and convert it to fully automatic than it is to get some isotopes like you're talking about. And let's go right into the attack and the response, because I do want to get into that. And in this scene, Martine, go ahead and pull it up. It happens at 8 in the morning, which was always I was always worried as the chief of transit police. It's going to be my teams are always deployed during peak. Peak usually going to work, but certainly going home as well at our major hubs, because major hubs have a large amount of people, and that's what they hit the Liverpool Street, the bus depot. You see all the buses there. And their goal was to have that initial impact, as John's talking about, the explosive impact, where you have a lot of mass casualties, as well as the radiological plume, so to speak. And you said that's a little unrealistic. I don't know if the weight of the material would drop down and the plume would be as big. I'm not an expert on that, but it would, as John talked about, deny use of that area given the material that they use. So first, talk about the attack itself, and then the plume piece of this, Eric, and what'd you think of it in the movie, and was it realistic in your mind, given your knowledge?
The initial blast, obviously, that was from the explosives, and that actually, like they portrayed in the movie, caused secondary fires inside those buildings. I think they kind of made it almost look like an atomic explosion, so to speak, like a mushroom cloud, which was not realistic. You'd have a conventional explosion. Nobody there, and talking about the regular citizens, would know that that was an RDD. All they knew was it was an explosion. Even they alluded to in the command center, they don't know if it was a gas explosion, a terrorist attack, or a vehicle that exploded. Obviously, when the firemen first came on scene, their radiation detection equipment started going off, so they knew right off the bat what they were dealing with. They would not have known that there was alpha radiation present until they actually started doing some ground censoring and monitoring. So, which is kind of complicates the situation. Yeah, you could somewhat deal with the gamma radiation by getting people out of the immediate area with the hot zone, what we call the hot zone and the exclusionary zone, and you're going to be based that off of a modeling that was come up with by both FBI and ATF. It's basically an exclusion zone based on what kind of explosive it was and what was contained if they could find out. So again, a lot of it is obviously compressed for time, and then they allude to it. That was a little bit unrealistic when they said, that we also have alpha particles. Again, they probably wouldn't have been able to detect that till hours or maybe 1 or 2 days later once the investigators came in or more monitoring. But as far as a portion of that area being sealed off for quite some time, that's pretty accurate. Depending, there's a lot of experts that would have to come in. As far as federal agencies, and if this happened in the United States, it would become a federal response immediately. So the feds would take over, the locals would assist with their expertise. But as far as keeping that area closed for quite some time, years, that's pretty accurate, depending on
nuclear. So I mean, I can remember training on chemical stuff that you can get some chemicals that are fairly light, and the dispersal or the movement of that is can be pretty wide. Is it the same for nuclear material? Is the nuclear material a little more heavier, so it can't be as the obviously this depends on wind too and things like that. But let's just say a light breeze. I mean, would it drop fairly quickly, or would it stay up in the air atmosphere?
That's
go ahead, John.
Upon the agent, and there are people that study this, like Oak Ridge National Laboratories are the specialists, go-to specialists on the medical effects of ionizing radiation. There are other places like Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Los Alamos National Laboratory, Sandia Labs, and the entire Department of Energy networks have looked at detailed studies of fate and transport. It was what they call the plume, fate and transport of the particles. And it's going to depend upon which particle they use, which isotope is used. It's most likely going to be pellets or finely, ground powder. You could certainly put those into water, although that's not really effective to disseminate with an explosion. But it's going to depend upon a couple things: the wind, what direction does it go, what speed is it, the quantity dispersed, and for example, if you look at the notional attack that occurred here in London, and interestingly, the National Academy of Sciences and Department of Energy in one of their studies looks at London in the same part of the city of London, which is a component of the metropolitan area. In the early morning, the wind is going to be more stable. In the late afternoon, it's going to be unstable. When you get into a densely populated urban area with high rises, and because topography and terrain influence this, large buildings influence the wind. So you get canalization. And when you look at the models, most of the models for fate and transport assume a flat world. They're starting to get more detailed, adding terrain. But when you get into that urban terrain, there's going to be little eddies. Some places it's going to get really, really, really hot, and it's going to stay. Other areas it's going to get off and move. Usually with the radiation, the area up close is going to be really, really hot, and then it's going to take time for the things to move out. So you may do things like shelter in place close to the event to begin. And they did this in the movie. They told people shelter in place. They said stay where you are. You may want to time where you go. Where that gets hard is when people see on the news that there's been a blast and that there's radiation. Everybody's going to want to get away.
Yeah. And
they're going to, the people that need to get away first may not be the ones getting in on the freeway first. So you have this public, crisis management communication issue, which if you wait until you tell the public when the event occurs, they're not going to hear you, right? When you tell the people, you need to stay here to get deconned, and you're going to have hundreds of thousands of people, it's going to take us forever, who's staying?
And then that brings up the importance of public education. I mean, I guess about a year ago, I was asked to give a show. I guess New York was putting out the material on what to do in case of a nuclear attack, and it was a conservative radio show, so they thought it was an overreaction, and I just looked up FEMA, and it's just a list of FEMA's educational programs that they ultimately push out, and obviously it was lower risk compared to everything else, but it was one they wanted to get out there to train the public, and I had to kind of just explain to them. I go, wait, listen, the nuclear events could not just attacks. I mean, I think they have a nuclear plant nearby New York as well. I forget the name of it, and
Indian Point.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So you have to be prepared. So just getting information out there, like sheltering in place, but that brings up the important point of triaging, and based upon your limited resources, Eric, you end up having to triage, right? You end up, the people who are right there in the middle where explosions, you're going to try and minimize the impact to the ambulatory or people who you can deal with right away. Because that contaminated area, you need to get resources in before you can actually triage that area itself, right? Can you just explain triaging a little bit, a broad concept of triaging, and then triaging in relationship to the movie?
So basically, what triaging is going into a scene, whether it be an attack such as this portrayed, or it could be a mass casualty incident as a traffic collision. You go in there, first responders are going to be basically looking at who is viable as a patient. If it's somebody that is going to pass away, you're going to, unfortunately, you have to bypass that person, look at what patients are viable, and start categorizing them. Who's going to go to the hospital first? Who could stay? Who's what we call ambulatory? It can stand up and walk their way out if they have a gash on the arm or the leg or whatever. At that point, what they portrayed is now they're doing is a what we call it a technical decon. When you have somebody that's non-ambulatory, when they get on a stretcher and they're put in through that tent, and they're basically scrubbed down to get rid of the radiation. The other portion that they use is what they call mass decon, and what we practice in LA County, not only us, but with the county and city and fire and LAPD, is basically the quickest and dirtiest way to do it. And they kind of portray a little bit. Is you get two fire trucks side by side and you set up a gauntlet, and you just use copious amounts of water on these folks, and you try to scrub them down, but if you have 100,000 people that you have to decon, you're not going to be able to take that much time to actually scrub them down. You're just going to use copious amounts of water and get them out and out of the exclusion zone. And at that point, if you can, then you start doing checking for them to see if they're, if they have any leftover radiation that needs to be technically deconned. Right. But again, as far as those tents, those mass decons, and John could probably talk about this a little bit better. They're pre-positioned around the county. Number one is, when was the last time that agency actually pulled that trailer out, pulled the equipment out, and tested it, number one. And number two, trained on it and ran a scenario through it. That there's a lot of ifs on that. And based on the population, LA County's got 11 point something million residents. Yeah. And that includes all 88 cities. Is that you don't have enough mobile decon units to you're not talking about deconning 11 million people, but a certain amount. So you're going to go back to triaging the folks that can walk out, and setting up a mass decon down and dirty is very quick and pretty efficient. Like I said, you only need two fire trucks and a copious amount of waters. The vehicles that we drove when I was on the team, we had equipment to do mass decon on folks. And basically, the devices that we hook up to fire hydrants, and we trained on it, and basically set up. There was 4 different streams I went over, and to be able to decon folks. And again, County Fire, City Fire, LAPD, and actually, and I got to plug LA Port PD also. They do have a smaller hazmat detail, and a very large maritime component for detection. But in down and dirty, that's what triaging is in this type of incident.
So, hey, I want to thank a couple of our regular visitors who are here with us. The Mighty Orbots and Penny, thank you for listening to our show. Certainly like the show and share it with some friends. I got some great technical experts, and I'm happy to do the show. I realize as we're on this show that we are advocating for the continuation of the capacity to be able to deal with these events, because very few people are probably talking about this stuff right now. But we are here today on Pop Culture Minefield Morning Coffee with the Chief, and it's kind of a heady subject that we're talking about as we have coffee in the morning. And John, I did want to get into now we managed an event together. It was Chatsworth Train Crash, and I really want to kind of talk about I think it was you that said a phrase that I had not heard before. It's the accordion effect, right? So in that event, we had 25 dead. I think we had 40 that were airlifted out, seriously injured that were airlifted out. We had like 25 helicopter things where they dropped in, picked the patients up, and took them off. It was a big operation. But as you explained it, was I think you coined the phrase to me because I hadn't heard it before. It gets real big, real fast, and then gradually it slows down. And what you call it, I think you call it an accordion effect. Kind of explain that, because I see that's what's going to happen here. Big event, and the accordion is going to go a lot slower on this event because there's other mitigating issues. But just explain how that works.
Well, every disaster, every emergency, every riot, every battle has an operational tempo. And certain events start like an earthquake, very sudden, immediate impact, and then some of the impacts are not known for a while. And then as you get deeper into it, you see where they go. They ebb and flow. A train crash, catastrophic, it occurs. Large number of casualties at one point. Some people leave, and one thing to keep in mind is they're not all necessarily going to be on the scene. They may be what you call convergent casualties, leaving and going to the hospitals. That's why when you look at something like this event here, you have the immediate blast occurs, the people get entrapped, they get killed, injured, or entrapped. Some leave. Some are going to get away before you even set up your cordon, create your zones of operation. You don't get the opportunity to decon them because they're already on the way to the hospital, which means you have to set up those decon locations, not just at the incident and surrounding the incident. You're going to need to control them at the hospitals where people are going, which means you need a broader capability. And in each one of those places, you need somebody who conducts, provides crowd control, traffic control, security. So you need buku cops everywhere, and they need to be coordinated so they're acting in concert, not exacerbating each other's problem. Now, one of the things that occurred at the Chatsworth crashes, people got tunnel vision, and rightfully so from a human perspective, on the immediate gore of the event, and didn't look at what happens over time. Like, there's going to be environmental mitigation. The oil from the diesel from the engine, if it's penetrated, is going to get into the ground. It could get into the groundwater, could kill animals. You need to look at that. You need to create an investigation, right? The investigation is going to take a long time to mitigate, to figure out who actually did it, what actually happened, how many people have actually been impacted, and what are the secondary and tertiary impacts of that event. And those tend to get slow moving, because I think the close of this movie, they said, well, it may take years to figure out, to clean this. And no, well, the question among a lot of the environmental health specialists that look at this is, how clean is clean? How do you know when you've mitigated those excess cancers, right?
But that tempo is going to hit a peak at a certain point, right? And then you're going to start coming down off that peak. And the quicker you mitigate the fear related to the event, the quicker you get it under control, you minimize the impact of the terror that the terrorist wants to have, right? So there is an importance. So there is a reason to have sufficient capacity. There is a reason for making sure that you have a competent response, because lots of times we get into we need to be really good at responding. We also need to really be good at detecting, which I'm going to get into in a minute. But you have to have that competent response, because you're rebuilding that trust, because you just failed. You blew it. You did not stop an attack. And as government, your job is now to demonstrate that you have some level of capacity to mitigate the attack. And I always felt that was a strong part of dealing with terrorism, right? Is you have to mitigate, you have to bring it back down as best you can,
well,
and to rebuild that confidence with the public.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that's important, and one of the challenges I faced managing an intelligence program was, and rightfully so, everybody wanted to interdict and prevent the attack. And I agree, that's the goal. That is also, in the real world, probably impossible every time, right? Because there are such a wide variety of threats. They come all the time. I remember there was a judge that was dealing with a terrorist attack in the UK, and the anti-terrorist branch, which is now the counterterrorism unit. They've changed, or counterterrorism division. They changed the name. It's like that. The terrorist only has to be right once. We have to be right every time.
All time.
That's difficult. And people would say we want to work on the interdiction. I'd say yes, we work on interdiction, but intelligence doesn't stop the minute the attack occurs. Intelligence continues with the response. And I think one of the reasons is because there may be multiple simultaneous attacks online. And if you notice in this scenario, they had at least a couple other, devices that could be interdicted. And they had, the specialist operations guys, the SO-19, which would be now called, the MO-19. They've changed the name when they reorganized. Those guys took out those terrorists rather effectively. And they used things like, CCTV cameras and automated license plate, readers to be able to do that. But when you prevent those additional attacks, you help degrade the terrorist organization. When you get attribution and you can determine who was involved in that chain. Because remember, every radiological device, every isotope, they have a signature. You can, they're not immediately available, and you need specialized detection capability, neutron detectors and things like that. But there's a signature. You can actually figure out, in many cases, where the things were produced, where it came from, what lot it came from. And then you can figure out, well, who was involved in trafficking. And so you can deny in the future. So yes, we want to prevent every attack, but even when the attack occurs, there's still a lot of work to be done.
And actually capturing the suspects that are alive as quickly as possible also rebuilds that trust with the public, that you have the capability to respond, and we respond both response-wise but investigative-wise, and we want to hold them accountable. Those are all important pieces to. Actually, I used to say, hey, if we want to have the policies we have to be able to defend ourselves so that we can have those policies, right? That's really what it's about. And but I wanted to get in something that you just talked about, because they bring it up. After the attack, they are looking for that second suspect. They're doing their investigative process. And the show was kind of a balance. The movie was a balance between the investigative process and the response process. And we've been talking more about the response process, I think. But they are using all their tools, and they have what they call the Ring of Steel in London. Now, I visited those guys a while back, and I got a briefing from Scotland Yard on their capacity and their Ring of Steel, and they've been using it for a long time. For the fellows up north, I think they used to say, they're interdicting the IRA coming down and doing their stuff, right? So they've been in the game for a long time, and they developed a camera system, automated license plate reader system, to help to gather and detect information, as we saw in the movie. You want to explain the importance of this type of equipment, John, and then the integration, and then it's the gathering of intelligence and the utilization of that intelligence for your boots on the ground. I know that's a loaded question, a long one, but you got a couple of minutes, so go ahead and go for it.
Well, And before, I'm going to kind of reiterate a couple of the things I mentioned before. Gathering of intelligence is multifaceted. It's going to require, first, a set of requirements. What intelligence do we need? Where can we get that intelligence? What means are going to be there? So you create requirements. I'd say there's a ubiquitous requirement, a standing intelligence requirement in a large metropolitan area, a place like the city of London, that's a known target. There are places in Los Angeles that us three know are persistent targets that would always be on our radar screen that we'd want to look at. And for those places that you know are, and a place like Wall Street in New York, or the National Mall in D.C., certain airports, seaports, they're always going to be on that hit parade. Certain large rail terminals, so you're going to know those are there. So you're going to want to calibrate your wide sensing to look at what's happening there. Look at, are there, because everything that occurs is a transaction. Some transactions have signatures that are consistent with criminal or terrorist behavior. So you want to collect, you want to be able to sort through when you start to see things mount up to show that they're an indicator of a threat. You want to enhance your collection, just like they did here, when they're like, okay, we think there are more. Let's look for more transit vans. Let's look at how you could move material in. So you're triangulating lots of pieces into one piece. You're trying to ask yourself, what is the best way to get this information in a timely manner and get it to the right decision maker? And in a terrorist attack here, unlike strategic intelligence, you have strategic, operational, and tactical intelligence converging. There are many people that need parts of that information stream to effectively do their job. The patrol cops on the beat, they need to know, hey, we're in a heightened threat period, look for this and report this to a given place at a given time. The detectives are going to need to be told, okay, we're looking at a group that could be moving materials, and we need to look at the financial records, we need to look at travel records, and you need to target them. The fire responders and the ambulance corps or the EMS people, well, they have needs too. They need to be told, be recipients of intelligence, hey, you may be facing this threat, but hey, by the way, while you're out there, look at your personal radiation detectors, or whatever your threat is. Look for these indicators and report them back so we can come up with a cohesive response. So there are lots of pieces, some of them human intelligence, the investigators going out there talking to people and saying, hey, what's happening? I will point out in this video, they decided to use waterboarding as a means of gaining information.
Intelligent. Well, I mean, that's part of the drama of it, I imagine. But I needed to get into the technology piece because, we automated license plate reader cameras, regular cameras. There's a big pushback in the States, particularly in Los Angeles and California, that, it's infringing on your freedom. All of these systems are out in the public, and they're just gathering information that's publicly out there. And I just, I personally think that the downside of the use of these things, and people think are infringement of their freedoms, can be managed. I mean, because really it's people using information inappropriately. I think I heard a story from the Independent Institute where they wrote a paper about some police officer going in and finding out who his wife was cheating with or whatever, using information. Those things can be managed, right? Through policies, and our policies were kind of rough when we started using automated license plate reader, but they do add value and they do add a ring of security. They do help, and I think that we need to get past those the fear, and I just think that because I just think it helps to make us more efficient, whether it's terrorism or crime, and not using those tools like they used in London is a mistake for us. I just feel that way.
No, I think you're right, but I think you have to be careful which technologies you mix, and different technologies are going to have different thresholds, and there's a balance. And obviously, automated license plate readers are a very valuable tool, and they're valuable. They're more valuable when you triangulate that with the CCTV camera, so you don't just have the car went here, but you can see where this was. You can triangulate that with radiation detectors, chemical detections, different standoff devices at right places to say, okay, these come together to be a threat. Now, there's obviously Fourth Amendment protections on search and seizure, and some means of mass gathering of information are questionable, depending on where they're targeted and how they're used. Some of the CCTV, if you look at automatic, facial recognition is an example. Well, facial recognition is getting better, but it has been known to give false positives, and it has been known to amplify certain biases.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I just think those can be managed, and
They can be managed if you're
I think we should not pull back on them in those looking for the worst case scenario and say we have to get rid of all of it because of this. I think is a mistake, and I think the City of London has demonstrated that this can be used and managed properly. We need to get into another scene, though. Go ahead and roll right into response challenges, Martine, because I really did want to talk about the challenges of coordination. So you have a big event like this, and let's say it's in LA. You got the sheriff's people rolling, you got LAPD rolling, you got LA City Fire, you got LA County Fire, and you got all of our other participating parties, and that creates, in London, I mean, they're all pretty much one state entity that runs the state there. But here you got municipal, you got state, you got federal, and you got multiple municipal partners in here. And it becomes a really big coordination thing. You saw that in 9/11. Can you talk about that coordination and the importance of the drills that they did on the front end, Eric, and how that translates to success on a response?
Okay, well, part of the thing that I was involved in was securing the city's program, and that basically brought all of the law enforcement, fire, public health into one room to discuss that possibility of, number one, of an accidental release, or God forbid, an attack. One of the things that they did have was a not so much a coordination center, but basically a notification system whenever one of us was responding to a radiological type of incident, whether it be an accident or otherwise, to notify our partners. Now, let's say we were responding to something similar to this incident. Is my first thing is, aside from our safety, is getting those folks on board, saying, hey, we're responding to this. I know for a fact right now, LAPD, I'm going to need you guys. I need you guys to respond to me, not nowhere else. County Fire, City Fire, so we're going to be co-located together, and we're going to basically come up with a mission, specific details for each responding agency. Because what the one thing you do not want to have is some agencies going rogue, as we call it, and start doing their own thing, because then you lose basically accountability. You lose the whole response component of that if they start doing their thing without anybody else knowing. Now, the response is going to be local. By this time, you have the Department of Energy that's already been notified. Well, actually, FBI is going to be notified before DOE does. They're going to be responding because they're going to be our partners in this thing. Once the initial response is done, and it's going to be basically chaos. Is you're going to be controlling chaos at a major incident like this. Things are not going to be done by the book and correctly, because there's so many variables in an incident like this that you're just trying to manage chaos the best possible. And like John and you alluded to, is that the accordion effect is, it's going to be, you're going to be going 100 miles an hour when you first arrive, and you may be going 100 miles an hour for 1 or 2 days, but eventually that's going to start scaling back little by little. By that time, you're going to have more resources than you can ever imagine. There was a joke between me and my counterpart at the FBI, is hey, Eric, we have the C-130s. They're propping, they're spinning props right now. They're coming from Virginia. I said, outstanding. And I said, that means they're going to be there in 3 days. I said, yeah, so as a local person, you're going to have to manage chaos in the first, 24 to 48 hours. But eventually, you hope that everything goes as planned, semi as planned, to where you accomplish that mission that you set out to do.
Well, I'm confident that we're still doing a lot of this because we have natural disasters, and the benefits, if there are any benefits that came out of 9/11, is the National Incident Management System.
Mhm.
It's the common, everybody using the same language, everybody using a similar structure for how we run an operation, knowing and understanding who's in charge and who gives out those details on what you're going to do. Just and these were failures, and nothing against New York or at the Pentagon. These were just weaknesses we had in our system that this large events told us that we had to improve upon. And some of these systems most of them came from California because of our previous failures, right? So we do have a common set of language that we use. We use the same language when we're managing these events. We have interoperability now. Communication is always a big one in a drill or an event. There's always breakdowns and failures, and we are constantly trying to improve it. But it's the importance for investing in response, investing in the various systems that John has talked about. That's what's going to allow us to be successful. And and you see some of that. Go ahead, John. You want to say something?
Yeah, real quick, Pat. Is there?
Yeah,
you alluded to the many. When you have an incident like this happening, it doesn't matter whose dirt, what we call whose dirt it happens on, is that you're going to have a lot of political motivation, or they're going to try to politically motivate. And when I'm talking about politically motivate, is you're going to be your local politicians that are going to want to get up there on the podium and start talking. You're going to have your upper echelon, your chief or your sheriff, is going to be the one person that wants to be up on the podium. There's going to be a lot of tug of war of who's going to say those first words. And one thing that I think we all learned was, and it was kind of pressed upon, I don't know how it is now, is one voice, one message. And even though they hounded on that constantly, and the most practical thing that happens here all the time are brush fires, is they want one person speaking up on the podium for all. The problem is that when you get that rogue politician who is up for re-election that has their own press conference and starts giving a lot of misinformation. So it is basically kind of gathering those folks together to give one mission or one message is probably going to be the toughest part. The other thing I want to real quick point out is that, today's disasters is today's focus. And everything else gets pushed aside. John will remember this because when I was emergency operations bureau, I had the duty when the earthquake happened in Japan. I got woken up at 3:00 in the morning, and we had a brand new lieutenant. I called him up. I said, "Good morning, welcome to EOB. We just had an earthquake in Japan." He goes, "Why do we care about an earthquake in Japan?" That next morning, within 5 hours, the board of supervisors, like Sheriff Baca, were having a press conference, and everything else was tabled, and earthquakes was it for months and years. But after that, it faded away. So there's certain things that you have to keep on in front of the line, and you have to keep impressing upon not only your team, but your folks that are running your department. Because if not, it's going to be something that's going to be shelved away, and it's not going to be given the priority.
I think I think Baca was fairly well restrained in these events. At least that was my appearance, my feeling at the Chatsworth train crash. And I think people in the police environment tend to understand it, and it's the politicians that get in the way. But I want to put props out there for FEMA, our federal partners, everybody. I think we've done a good job since 9/11 in improving our game. I just want to see us continue to maintain investments in the areas that allow us to be successful, because an attack will come, whether it's in my lifetime or not. We don't want to regress. But John, we need to move on to the next scene, because I want to ask you about taking him out. Now we've talked about how do you take out a suicide bomber, right? What's the best strategy? And the strategy they used with this was just a few ounces of lead to each one of these guys, and that's pretty much what they had. I think they showed a button. They had their finger on the button. They're heading to their next whatever site. Probably it could have been. They might have been heading as close to that event as they could get to do another bomb or another location where there's a lot of people. I think they might have been. They didn't say, but there was nobody where they were at, so they clearly weren't going to explode it there. They were going to go where there were people at. But they took them out with just shooting them, right? So talk about the challenges of taking out a suicide bomber, or who you perceive as a suicide bomber.
Well, Pat, that's an interesting question. That's one, talking about politicians in the aftermath. That's certainly a challenging scenario. I believe that in this movie, when the specialist, SO-19, the armed, response officers took out those two terrorists, that was a lawful use of deadly force under the British system, would be lawful use of force under the entire common law system, would be lawful here, and it would be lawful even under the civil law system in other parts of the world. The dilemma comes, that's pretty easy decision-making scenario here. You have a transit van that's already been linked to a terrorist conspiracy. They have the license plate number tied to that conspiracy. They know that there was chatter passed from the intelligence service about a series of attacks. They know there have been recon. That's clear. Where it's more ambiguous. They're not in the vehicle, not known to be a terrorist, but you have somebody wearing a heavy jacket in the summer, a parka, walking through a transit station. And are they a terrorist, or are they just a mentally, emotionally disturbed person, a person with substance abuse or some kind of psychiatric problem? And so the discernment there becomes harder. So you need to start looking at behavior. Not, in this case, the behavior is clear. It already been articulated. They're there. On a day-to-day, if you're just working patrol, it gets harder.
Yes.
And even if you have a known threat period, well, real life intrudes upon your known threat period too. You can have mentally ill people who are despondent, who are not necessarily listening to orders, but aren't a threat to anybody necessarily, that could get taken out. I know there were scenarios where people in the aftermath of I believe it was the 7/7 attack, or the attack on the London Underground, in the months after that, people engaged in, wasn't in the U.S., it was in another nation, but engaged in like fare evasion, jumping a turnstile, and then they get, they were taken out. I believe there was some controversy there. So I mean, it really comes down to a high degree of training and decision making for the police, which means you have to exercise regularly, providing as much good, precise intelligence as you can to the responding officers, so they know there's a threat picture. Bringing it not just to the line cop walking the beat or responding in a radio car, but to the dispatchers who are taking the information when it comes, to get as much good information as they can to be able to relay that to the field. Getting watch commanders monitoring the desk, so when they hear something of that nature, to get out of their office in there with the dispatcher and actively, intervening when necessary to provide advice to the responders, to get a sergeant there as quick as possible. So there's, even on very small things, there's lots of behind the scene coordination that truthfully we do every day. And when we do it well, nobody ever knows we did it. And sometimes when it goes bad,
everybody knows about it. Well, in this show, obviously, they clearly show that there was clear evidence these are likely a secondary assault team. Yeah, and they take them out. I mean, we've had this conversation. If you really know for sure it's a suicide bomber, you have to shoot them. Our military dealt with these folks as they try to use suicide bombs in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. Go ahead and roll into the next scene, bad guy. And I think what I really want to talk about as we close up is there is still a threat. As they show this last scene, and it's the one guy who was the coordinator, and we have a few of those guys in custody, right? And Rahman's one of them. All these other guys are in custody. These guys haven't gone away, and they'll still plan. And they talk about how it is an issue of faith for them. It's an issue of pride for them. They're not done. They may be down. We may have degraded their capacity, but they are a group that we need to watch, as well as we watch other groups. I don't think we can let down on terrorism. I think we need to look at all of our different interdiction capabilities and make sure that we're doing a process. So, Eric, I'll give you a word, and then John a final word, and then I'll close out. What do you think?
Uh, yeah, like you said, that they're in it for the long run. They're not going to stop just because they got arrested. They're going to do their work from the inside behind the walls. So it's something that we as a country have to continue being vigilant about, and the locals have to remain vigilant as to their mission. Each specialized unit has their very specific mission, and they got to keep up on that. They have to, what we say, you have to keep up on your craft. It's a perishable skill. You have to keep up on it, work with your partners. You have to keep up on the intelligence, see what's going on locally and nationally and internationally, to be able to pick up on these trends. So, yeah.
So, John, 30 seconds. This is still a threat, and your recommendations. Give us and what we should do. Obviously, it could be very verbose, but it's staying vigilant, right?
Well, yes. I mean, staying vigilant, which requires not becoming complacent, not thinking the threat is gone, knowing that threats come in a variety of packages, and knowing that you need to exercise, you need to build command capability, and knowing that new evolving threats are occurring. Like this was a dirty bomb RDD capability. Well, there's a current threat vehicle that could make that more viable, and those are, small aerial unmanned systems or drones that can disseminate, chemical, biological, radiological means. They can bring small explosives to bear, and we're seeing them used by Mexican drug cartels. We're seeing them used by gangs in Brazil, and we're seeing them used in warfare in the Ukraine.
And that could be something they could do. That they could just reach out, and they don't even have to be there where the apparent point of attack is with drones. And right,
they tried to assassinate the President Maduro of Venezuela a couple of years ago with a couple of small UAS. So yes, it's feasible, it's possible. We don't want to go over the top and say that's only a threat, because those are tools for us too. We can now interrogate the area with drones. We can bring drones in with sensors and cameras and use them for command and control. So we need to be aware there are multiple threats. We need to know this threat hasn't gone away. We need to look at convergent threats, but most importantly, we need to train all levels of emergency responder, cops, firefighters, emergency medical personnel, to work together as a cohesive team at all levels of government.
Okay, I gotta start wrapping up here. I want to thank both of you guys for coming on my show. Probably a very interesting discussion for people who had not heard this kind of stuff before. Hopefully you'll stick around for a quick debrief so we can talk about the show. This is Pop Culture Minefield, Morning Coffee with the Chief. We reviewed the movie Dirty War. Now last week I did The French Connection. So if you haven't seen that one, go back and watch that. This show is every Tuesday, 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, Morning Coffee with the Chief. And this was Dirty War. And thank you to Eric Fox and Dr. John Sullivan, for being with me today. Martine, are you ready to take it away?
Those sons of bitches.
Ma, I'm doing a show!